Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. We spend so much of our waking lives inside organizations, navigating their structures, taking directions, doing the work. But how often do we actually stop and look at the massive, intricate blueprint of how these entities are designed in the first place? Today, we're going to dive right in and explore the fundamental, often invisible concepts of organizations and management together.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to decode the modern organization, look at the basics of management, break down managerial functions and roles, analyze the different types of organizations out there, and finally, explore the modern workplace evolution.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, Decoding the Modern Organization. What exactly is an organization anyway?
Let's start things off with a pretty provocative question. Why do we even need organizations? It sounds super basic, right? But think about it. As Chris Argyris, who's a prominent thinker in this space, points out, our civilized life would essentially collapse without them. We absolutely need organizations because the sequences of activities required to achieve really major objectives are just way too massive for one individual to handle alone. A single person literally cannot build a fully functioning hospital or manufacture thousands of cars or run a global supply chain. So organizations allow us to chop up these massive, overwhelming tasks into sequential units that human beings can actually manage.
The management expert Stephen Robbins defines an organization like this. He calls it a consciously coordinated social entity with a relatively identifiable boundary that functions on a relatively continuous basis to achieve a common goal. Now, I really want to draw your attention to that phrase right there, identifiable boundary, because it's not just a physical wall or a building. An organization actually has layers of boundaries. The innermost layer holds the internal employees and the directors. Then the next layer out holds external stakeholders, then customers, suppliers, the media. And then that outermost boundary, that interacts with massive macro variables like the wider economy, politics, and technology. It's like a giant interconnected puzzle.
Moving on to Section 2, the basics of management. Who actually keeps these entities alive and functioning? If we look at the typical corporate structure and move up the pyramid, we generally see three really distinct levels of management required to coordinate all this activity. Down at the foundation, we've got supervisory or junior management. They directly connect to the operational staff, and they're hyper-focused on directing and controlling the daily tasks. Then just above them is middle-level management. These folks act as the coordinating glue. They create cooperation among departments to carry out detailed organizing. And finally, sitting at the peak, we have top management. That's your board, your directors. They're the ones setting the grand vision, handling policy decisions, and making sure the organization's overall financial health and sustainability are on track.
And what's really fascinating is how the specific skills you need actually change as you climb that ladder. Notice how technical skills are absolutely paramount at the junior level, but they kind of fade out as you move to the top, getting replaced entirely by high-level conceptual thinking. Meanwhile, middle management, that requires an incredibly heavy dose of human skills, the ability to connect, motivate, and coordinate people on a massive scale.
The overarching crucial point here is summarized perfectly by the management theorist Lyndall Urwick. He argued that pure ideology doesn't build a better future. It is the effective, sound management of people and materials that actually raises our standard of living. Basically, management is the engine that turns abstract resources into tangible society-improving results.
Now, to actually achieve that sound management, classical theorists had to develop some serious guidelines. Henri Fayol famously outlined 14 timeless principles, but I've pulled out 5 of the most critical ones for us here. These core 5 really highlight just how much classical management prioritized strict order. Take unity of command, for example, the idea that subordinates should take orders from only one authority to prevent chaos. Or the scalar chain, which insists on a completely unbroken flow of authority from the very top all the way down. And esprit de corps, which champions total team unity. It's a highly structured, almost medievally strict, military-inspired view of efficiency. Let's transition over to Section 3, managerial functions and roles, basically the daily grind.
So, there's actually a pretty important technical difference between a function and a role. A manager's formal job description, their function, requires them to plan the vision, organize the structure, and staff the teams. Once that team is actually in place, they have to direct performance, communicate ideas clearly, make the really tough decisions, and finally, control the outcomes by measuring actual performance against predetermined standards. Honestly, if a manager isn't actively doing these 7 things, they simply aren't functioning in their role.
But beyond those formal functions, a manager also has roles, which is more about what they are expected to do as a person of conscientiousness. Henry Mintzberg defined 10 of these roles, and he grouped them into 3 main categories. The first category is interpersonal. Picture a manager hyping up their team as a leader, acting as a crucial liaison with local regulators, or maybe cutting the ribbon at a new office, acting as a symbolic figurehead.
Next up, we have the informational roles. Here, the manager acts as a vital conduit. As a monitor, they're essentially the nerve center of the team, constantly scanning and absorbing external and internal industry data. And once they have that information, they have to strategically share it, acting as a disseminator to their internal team. Finally, as a spokesperson, they take the organization's plans and confidently communicate them outward to the press or external boards.
And finally, Mintzberg details the decisional roles. This is where managers have to put on their entrepreneurial hats to take initiative and explore brand new opportunities. They also have to play peacemaker, handling disagreements and restoring a productive culture when conflicts inevitably pop up. They hold the purse strings, carefully allocating budgets and resources. And of course, they must be highly skilled negotiators, bargaining over employee benefits or external vendor contracts. It's a lot to juggle for sure.
All right, Section 4, Types of Organizations. How are these places actually structured?
Management theorist Hicks identified that we can classify organizations on a continuum, stretching from formal to informal. A highly repetitive manufacturing plant, for instance, might lean heavily formal. I mean, it absolutely needs rigid, defined, durable structures just to mass produce safely. But a creative service agency? That thrives in the spontaneous, loose, and totally undefined informal space to generate fresh ideas. Now, in reality, most modern workplaces blend a bit of both, but figuring out exactly where your organization sits on this continuum is absolutely crucial to understanding its unique culture.
Similarly, we can contrast organizations by looking at the emotional ties of their members. Primary organizations are defined by complete emotional involvement. Think of a tight-knit charity, a religious sect, or a really passionate social club. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum are secondary organizations, which are purely contractual. Think of your massive corporate conglomerate where employees just punch a clock solely for a paycheck. And hey, maybe the free coffee in the break room. Again, it's a continuum, but knowing where your organization falls changes everything about how you manage its people.
Which brings us to our final act, Section 5, the modern workplace evolution. Going from rigid ladders to flat networks.
Look, the business landscape today is simply brutal. Economies are joining hands, which means domestic organizations face much stiffer global competition than ever before. You've got giant corporate mergers making it incredibly hard for the smaller players to even survive. And crucially, technology is increasingly substituting human power. The era of economic protectionism is disappearing fast, and it's forcing companies into an absolute high-stakes adapt or die scenario. And this brings us to a terrifying but totally fascinating concept. We have officially entered the era of obsolescence. Continuous innovation is the absolute rule of the game now. This means your company's cutting-edge technology, your specialized skills, and even your best managerial ideas are almost instantly outdated by the next big thing. Organizations literally have to focus heavily on continuous individual and organizational learning just to tread water.
So, to survive this era of obsolescence, modern organizations are undergoing some radical makeovers. They are totally abandoning those tall, rigid, classical ladders we discussed earlier in favor of flatter, more circular structures with way fewer layers. FlexiTime and FlexiPlace are rapidly becoming the standard just to attract highly technical talent. Because the service sector is dominating right now, organizations are actively empowering middle and junior management, the people actually interacting with the customers, giving them the power to make major decisions. And rather than keeping massive permanent departments for routine work, they're increasingly outsourcing those repetitive tasks. It's a completely different world.
So let's wrap things up with this final, crucial question for you to think about. Is your organization built for the classical era, clinging to those rigid scalar chains and purely formal structures? Or is it equipped for the modern era, flatter, flexible, and continuously learning to survive the era of obsolescence? Evaluating the health and future readiness of the organization you clock into every single day is the very first step to truly understanding the mechanics of your own working life. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. I hope this explainer has entirely transformed the way you look at the buildings, the Zoom calls, and the structures you navigate every single day.